knowledge production in the humanities become computationally formed, we must reflect on the status of critique and the digitally shaped infrastructure of thinking. Today's book is particularly relevant to the question Catherine Hales raises, as it has emerged from the CSDS itself, from the Sarai program housed here. Today we are discussing Lives of Data, Essays on Computational Cultures from India, edited by Sandeep Mertia. Here are today's panelists. The first panelist is, who's the editor of the book, is Sandeep Mertia, who's a PhD candidate at the Department of Media, Culture and Communication and Urban Doctoral Fellow. He's an ICT engineer by training and former research associate at the Sarai program, CSDS. Jahnavi Phalkey is founding director of the Science Gallery, Bangalore. Previously, Phalkey has held a tenured position at King's College London. She has been a fellow of the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin. A historian of science, Phalkey is the author of Atomic State, Big Science in 20th Century India, and has co-edited Science of Giants, China and India in the 20th Century. Nimmi Rangaswamy is an associate professor at IIIT and adjunct professor at IIIT, both in Hyderabad. She brings an anthropological lens in understanding the impacts of AI research and praxis. Rangaswamy's research approaches AI in the everyday intersections of computation and social life. Using ethnographic methods, she studies the human-machine interface to demystify the role and impact of digital technologies in the everyday. Finally, Stefania Milan is Associate Professor of New Media at the University of Amsterdam. In 2021, Milan is a faculty associate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. Her work explores the interplay between digital technology, activism, and governance. Milan is the author of Social Movements and the Technologies Wiring Social Change. So a few words about the format today. Speakers will speak for 10, 12 minutes. After that, questions may be sent in the chat function. Before I move to the speakers today, a few words about the context of our discussion. 2020, which will be called the year of the 21st century pandemic, I think has made data legible in ways that we could never imagine before. The combination of the biomedical and the informational has materialized data in deeply effective ways. Data is our poison, our antidote, the wind of misinformation storms, the endless power of platform capitalism, the speculative power of the stock market. It is entirely possible that the informational practices that have emerged in the past year will have become generalized in the coming decade. We have also seen large-scale social debates over data, surveillance, and the power of media platforms. The legal scholar Julie Cohen has spoken of a new biopolitical public domain, which is a construct, as she calls, of extraordinary power, which now pursues the world of personal data as a commons to be attached to value. Cohen writes, and I quote, "The idea of a public domain of personal data has catalyzed far-reaching reorganizations of socio-technical activity to facilitate harvesting personal data in the wild and to mark such data once collected as owned." In this new biopolitical domain, participation in an information system is almost compulsory, enlisting populations via governance structures, consumption, commerce, voting. Some have argued that what we are going through is really a 21st century version of Karl Polanyi's famous thesis of the double movement in modern capitalism. In his 1944 book, The Great Transformation, Polanyi argued that advanced capitalist economies experience a double movement. As markets expand and commodified labor and land, counter movements emerged to limit their reach and influence. If data, through users' free labor on platforms, produces value that becomes generalized, the main question is this, and this is a question for today: how does this materialize itself? The most interesting question from early modern informational history suggests not the dialectical dynamic of Polanyi's double movement, but I think a series of multiplicities. In India, for instance, Colonial power was based on the extensive deployment of paper-based information systems for routine policing as well as managing migrants, epidemics, and cross-border movements. We know that in independent India, entry into welfare databases constituted an important vector of everyday life. As the anthropologist Matthew Hull demonstrates, anxieties about the non-correspondence between words and things pervaded colonial and post-colonial bureaucracies, leading to a multiplication of authentication systems of stamps, counter-signature, and paper genres. Document systems sought to collectivize bureaucratic power and render it distinct from a public. Equally, this power could be diluted by constant circulation of files and overwriting by multiple officials. The emergence of a data economy poses the question, and this is the question for today. What is the relationality of these forms? Can a relational approach to data open up and fracture the existing approaches to the platform economy? I think this is the most exciting thing about the lives of data, edited by Sandeep, emerging from workshops in this very seminar room from where I speak. To tell us more, over to Sandeep. Can we zoom to him, please? Yeah.
Hello. Hi, am I audible? Right. Thank you so much, Ravi, Ravi Sundaram, Ravi Vasudevan, and everybody at Sarai and CSDS. I first must thank them, for the book, of course, but if it weren't for them, I would be somewhere in Bangalore or Hyderabad working in one of the IT companies. So one is deeply grateful to them for opening this research possibility for scholars with a tech background venturing into social sciences and trying to do something new. One is also extremely grateful to all the contributing authors of this volume who come from a very wide range of backgrounds, from data sciences and open data movements to anthropology, history of science, media studies, and so on. It's that range of their expertise that really gives us an understanding of what the object that we are approaching, that it doesn't really belong to any one particular discipline, as maybe 50 years ago, statisticians might have laid claims to data in certain ways, or today's big data scientists might want to lay claims on data as an object of research, inquiry, knowledge production, mediation, business, governance, and so on. The range of expertise in this book allows us to challenge those claims and reclaim data as an object of inquiry, not just for people sitting somewhere in Palo Alto or, Whitefield in Bangalore, but as a much larger field, which is experienced as life by large number of people now. So in my contextualization of the book, I'll just try to highlight two aspects about why we decided to do this, and what are data, why study the lives of data, and in order to do so, as I try to do in my introduction, why focus so closely on relationalities. So I have two broad points to make here, and then we'll open it up for further panel discussion. First is, the object in itself is lively. It takes on lives of its own over time as it circulates across different systems, machines, contexts, geographies, etc., and is always defined and processed in relation with other objects. For example, the life of your Aadhaar card as a paper document, as a 12-digit number, a demographic data point, a machine-readable data point, a fingerprint biometric, an iris scan biometric, a facial photograph, which, by the way, can also sometimes be of Lord Hanuman or even that of a street dog. A digital object floating in hundreds of different national and regional government databases, and also in that of databases of banks, fintech apps, telecom and tech platforms, advertising agencies, leaked files, government or private, and in the good old paper files, perhaps accumulating dust instead of having serendipitous encounters with billions of electrons in hard drives and server farms. The data object, however, may never participate in any significant computational process after it is first collected and stored. For example, some people might relate, what happens to our to read lists and data associated with them? Mine mostly stays stable. Um, or it might go through 1 million transactions each day based on what is linked with or related to. For example, our mobile phone location data bouncing between telecom towers constantly, satellites, operating systems, apps, advertisers, delivery persons, and cops, and all kinds of other assemblages that operate between our senses, machines, and the social. Um, these assemblages are relational by design from the term relational database management systems, which all of us in engineering have to study for at least 1 or 2 semesters in terms of making databases for something as simple as libraries or banks. What is the relation between a customer and the institution, or what is the relationship between a student and the librarian? And those relationships are codified in the process of making these technologies. So where do we go from there to social media networks with billions of users? What are the relations there, how they are being designed, and how they are being modified based on our usage patterns? Any critical approach to study these phenomena has to begin by looking into how relationalities emerge, mutate, circulate, and how they affect and remediate all the existing media and technological forms. Because we didn't stop doing writing or cinema or music with digital technologies. They constantly remediate the older infrastructures in novel ways. The second important aspect that I wish to note today is that yes, there is enormous proliferation, ubiquity, unprecedented. I'm sorry for using that term. It should be, it's one of those 2020 terms. But it is truly unprecedented. So why do these assemblages matter so much in the here and now? Objects, things, tools, and technologies have been living in the wild, wild world of human sociality since at least the evolution of hands. And data has been involved in the designs of modern nation states and vice versa, from Napoleon's France to Mao's China and everything in between, and now across different epistemic and political visions of quantitative and statistical knowledge, and also of visions of government, business, and leisure. Unlike older media objects and their infrastructures, such as film and, say, the exhibition space of a theater, or a wired telephone device, copper wires and telephone exchange operators, or a non-smart television and local cable station, or a human computer and a punch card machine, contemporary data objects and their relations with various infrastructures are qualitatively different, not just in terms of the now very well known and generic affordances of software like modularity, virality, and so on, but its versatility of abstractions, the versatility of abstractions in computational cultures that thrive on putting together large data sets together to find new patterns and new meanings of value. And as we know, now these data sets aren't made or used like the once in a decade survey, once in a decade census or annual surveys, but are deeply intermeshed with our everyday use of media and actively seek to predict, speculate, and influence our experience, subjectivities, socialities, etc. Anyone familiar with the history of internet would know that what happens to be our not so pleasant present could have been otherwise. The design that certain large technological companies of the day happen to have weren't the dominant designs when these technologies were coming up. So how did they ended up being like that? And not just in the context in which they were first innovated or first discovered or first patented or first business models came up, but are now more global than any other media technology we can compare to. So the challenge for us is to think through the long durée of quantitative knowledge production and the here and now, while knowing that we are also part of an ever accelerating temporality of digitization, as Ravi noted what has happened with COVID, and even before that. So the challenge for research in particular, and this is something that I struggle to wrap my head around often, that how not to mimic the temporality of Gartner hype cycle of emerging technology. Gartner is this market research firm that comes up with these annual beautiful graphs of what's hot in the industry, what's going to make the next $1 billion, and so on, based on research, I guess. But how not to mimic that? Because unfortunately, when we talk about global computational cultures, there are sites that are at the frontiers, then there are sites which are seen as users and adopters, and that is something that in the last 10 years, media studies, especially on digital media technologies, of course, we have a longer tradition of going back to cinema and colonial use of paper and bureaucracy and so on. But with respect to digital media technologies, this dichotomy between producers and users, the innovators and the rest of the world who are who have the agency to just update the app, that's really not how we discovered it works in practice, because there is a role that context plays in the emergence and in the circulation of these technologies. And what that context is not pretty straightforward. It involves certain technological affordances. It involves certain materialities that are harder than others. And it involves certain socialities that are not directly visible. Now, to quickly jump to the Indian context, while we keep the definition of context open, not as a good old anthropological cultural whole, because that's hard to imagine with these technologies. I'll quickly read a section from the introduction on page 18, Mapping Lives of Data in Digital India. By the way, this is the first time I'm holding the book today. What does big data in India want? What kinds of input and output of resources and ideas does it command and conjure? At the very least, big data techniques and projects rely upon the availability of apparently seamless digital infrastructures, techno-managerial expertise, large number of users, and tangible market or public policy outcomes. India has the world's largest number of software engineers, fastest growing mobile internet user base and market, that's been consistent for a while, and nationwide government programs for building a digital India, startup India, and 100 smart cities. And yet, it has highly fragmented infrastructural conditions of technological access, and nearly half of the population still does not have broadband internet access. We've all come across stories of what's happening with virtual classrooms and how pretty much majority of the population is on mobile phones trying to catch up in an already struggling education infrastructure system. However, looked at differently, the rapidly growing number of users of digital media, largely through mobile phones, display creativity in working out different approaches for imagining, accessing, and sharing media. The coexistence of large-scale state-sponsored technological projects and global technology ventures in India are opening new pathways for innovation and capital accumulation. We must remember that even as the Indian economy grows and political shifts release new aspirational energies, the social context is defined by incredible hierarchies of religion, caste, gender, and class. These exist alongside dizzying variations in formal literacies, languages, aesthetics, and media ecologies. The context sets up many generative and disruptive encounters with long-standing hierarchies and technocultural orders. In particular, digitally enabled forms of ethno-nationalism and majoritarian populism, from propaganda-savvy uncles in WhatsApp family groups to the ruling party's IT cell that commands an army of bots and trolls, are unsettling conventional wisdom about India's democracy in deeply consequential ways. In the face of accelerating media circulation, the state strives to assert sovereignty by censorship, internet shutdown, data localization, biometric identification, digital payments, and there's a new one, data sovereignty. Meanwhile, an imagined collective of the aspirational next billion users and excited publics capable of full stack defining. Full stack, by the way, is a term used as full stack developers who know all the skills from maintenance of a platform to building new products on it. Full stack defining and at times defying use of mobile phone driven media are participating in unmaking and making infrastructures and subjectivities that few scholars have been able to anticipate and theorize. The rapidly changing relationalities of computing in India imitate, adapt, and confuse ontologies of big data in ways that we have only started to explore. So that's a small nugget of what this book tries to do and what it is trying to explore and really explore, because this is a field in which many of the givens of social scientific research, media research, or humanities research do not hold up as they perhaps did 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Why? That's a conversation to be had. But so one of our key focus was to involve practitioners, and that's what also part of the Lives of Data research project and various other research projects at Sarai, to include practitioners in the conversation, because otherwise we are the focus of where these developments are going, where they're coming from, and alternative possibilities around them. There are many activists involved in open data movement in India. What's happening with that? Without having that conversation and only focusing on Aadhaar or certain tech companies gives us a very problematic view of the developments of the last 10 years or so. Now, lastly, I'll quickly walk you through the table of contents. Someone can help me with the PDF of the book. And we thank Institute of Network Cultures for producing this book so beautifully, and the great cover design and the open access feature, of course. Okay. I believe this scrolling is not generating any data unless Adobe has changed its policies. But scrolling on Facebook and Twitter does generate data. So here we are. Okay. Ravi's forward, which sets the context of the book and places it in the history of research that Sarai has done in the last 2 decades. So I, by the way, before writing this, wasn't a historian of statistics per se. There were certain compulsions that one could not, and Jahnavi is smiling and she'll know the reason why, that there were certain compulsions that one could not simply talk about India of Aadhaar and India of big data without talking about Prasanna Chandra Mahalanobis, the founding director of Indian Statistical Institute. So this chapter basically tries to discuss what human computers were doing in 1930s, 40s, 50s under Mahalanobis' training to set up the National Sample Survey and India's original post-independent statistical infrastructure. The next chapter by Carl Mendonca, who's a film studies PhD candidate and an artist based in California, is on an advertising company, Blaze Advertising, and how something as everyday part of media experience as the intermission between a movie happens to have programmatic lineages involved in terms of what is to be shown at that time and how that whole infrastructure is managed, showing that advertising reel to you and that backend infrastructure, and how that backend infrastructure can be modified to change into something else. Also related to the idea of infrastructures following the earlier pathways of analog infrastructures. The next one in the section of forms by Shivakumar Arumugam takes us a deep dive into history of science and probability and how these data models, which seem to predict, and I believe a lot of people in the subcontinent have a lot to say about how Duckworth-Lewis-Stern model works and doesn't work and its flaws. But there is something else it does other than the accuracy of the cricket scores. It orients us to a certain data future. And Arumugam unpacks how. The next chapter by Ranjit Singh, who's a postdoctoral researcher at Data and Society in New York, opens up how to study large-scale infrastructures like Aadhaar, which seemed like one thing in 2010, a completely different thing altogether by 2015. So how those layers are accumulating on top of each other, that's something Ranjit unpacks for us and asks us to focus on imbrication. The next chapter, Data Lives of Humanities Texts by P.P. Sneha, focuses on databases of humanities archives of poetry and cinema in terms of how they are reconfiguring the data object in storage, retrieval, access, and how it changes the whole research practice around it. So it's not just a simple adoption of technological affordances for more efficient work or research, it just changes the values involved in research. The next section, Political Designs, and the chapter is Hackathons, Labor Politics and the Organization of Public Passions by Lily Irani, I must note that in the list of contributors, Lily is the most senior contributor to this book. And I'm very happy to also say that the most enthusiastic contributor to the book. And one is really grateful that we were able to find collaborators like Lily. And so this chapter, like Lily's book, Chasing Innovation, maps this new terrain of entrepreneurial citizenship in India and how different kinds of hackathons produce different kinds of publics and ideas. The next chapter is by Anumeya Yadav, who has done pioneering ground reporting on Aadhaar and maps the experience of looking at a pilot project back in the early 2010s and before that, and how it grew up to be this large assemblage of legal problems, welfare problems, and leaving out people and excluding the people that it most needed to serve. The next chapter picks on this thread, Broken Data by Preeti Mudliar, who's an assistant professor at IIIT, and asks that what happens when your biometric authentication doesn't work? How do you understand your body through the process of that failure, and how your body feels as if it's broken data, it's not efficient enough for the system to deliver your welfare services, and how the designers of Aadhaar react or don't react to this problem. The next chapter is a special section of this book, Practices. And I'm really glad that for our workshops and our research, we were able to invite and participate with and collaborate with so many practitioners in the social sector, in the development sector, which operates slightly differently from government itself and private sector, of course. So chapter 9 outline India's experience of doing field surveys in rural India and how you use different technologies like drones and tablets and cognitive mapping to make sure that you collect the best possible data, because it is important data to inform policy making. But when the field is being transformed by carrying out survey on smartphones, etc., how do you change your research practices to accommodate those realities? The next chapter by Guneet Narula unpacks the politics of open data in the development sector, a sector which collects huge amount of data and then never shares it with anyone, or only shares it with its donors, maybe Gates, I don't know. So how do we challenge that status quo? And then next chapter, Gaurav Godwani's Making India's Budgets Machinable. This, by the way, if there are any experts on algorithms in the audience would appreciate, is something that Gaurav himself developed and put it out there on GitHub for open source, for which many startups were charging good amount of money to from the government to be able to read numerical figures of budget in PDFs, in government PDFs. Gaurav made the algorithm, Gaurav open sourced it, and he also very kindly wrote about it for the book. The last section is the ethnographic core of 3 chapters. Chapter 12, Hisab Kitab, the Hindi term, by Nupur Rawal. And it brilliantly captures how practices of gig economy workers have changed when the app is the only medium of adjudication of their work. How many kilometers has an Uber driver traveled? How much fuel charge, surcharge, etc., etc. The numbers that the app is showing appear in a certain way, but they note down their own numbers and how meaning unfolds in between the two forms. Chapter 13, Untitled Data by Akash Solanki, who's with us here. A brilliant ethnography of how in a state bureaucratic office, the government officer wants MIS to become universal, but WhatsApp and WhatsApp click paper files and paper files as analog images instead of Excel sheets, how they circulate and create a new complex of analog plus digital khichdi of sorts, in which we can only focus on imbrication and cannot really say what is purely digital about it. And the last chapter is perhaps most relevant in times of the pandemic, by Anirudh Raghavan, which opens up this world of an institution which should have been really active in the last year, but we haven't heard much from, the disease surveillance program, and how they conduct surveys and wait for data to come to life before making claims about endemics and so on. So yeah, this is the DOC. I think I've taken too much time already.
No, it's fine. I think you can stop sharing and yeah, you can.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sandeep. I think we'll start with the the larger panel, and I request Jahnavi to start her intervention, please.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ravi and Sandeep, for your kind invitation to join this panel. So just before the panel started, Nimmi and I were joking about age. And we desperately try to participate in what's happening around us. And I'd like to coin a word, ROMO instead of FOMO. So that should count as regret of missing out. And it's with that regret that I join you all today, because I should have been there at the Lives of Data meeting, to which Sandeep had so kindly invited me. And I could not because of a food poisoning incident, which, yeah. So I do regret that, especially now having seen the volume that came out of it. So in the first instance, congratulations for the enthusiasm, the energy that made such a volume possible. And as Ravi says in his introduction, the book or the compilation begins the difficult yet pioneering task of engaging with what life of information, life of data in India today means. And so it's really a very, very wide spread of essays that deal with the question from various angles. It opens up an area that is yet to be developed at full strength in the scholarly world on working on India, especially from the historical lens, which I understand best. So what I'll do today in the few moments that I have to respond to the book and the essays in it is to speak from where I understand it best, which is from the historical angle, and also from, so history of science, history of statistics is where I'll approach it from, given especially that we have a bona fide ethnographer and a bona fide digital, critical digital studies person on the panel. I think it's good for me to stick to these arguments. So Sandeep raised a question about how does one move away from the Gartner-like, or replicating Gartner-like patterns. And I think something that helped me most, and given that most of the contributors to this volume are young scholars, some of whom are colleagues, of course, we had this rule we followed, which was called the CCS, chronology, context, and specificity. And I think that if one were to run, every story through that machine, or crank it through that machine of chronology, context, and specificity, I think we would see probably much better writing, especially in this domain where we have not only contributors to this volume, but also in the larger public domain, people writing and commenting and participating in a debate on the digital, on the informational, on data, with very little critical distance. And I think what this volume accomplishes quite remarkably is an attempt at that distancing in order to understand the implications of data in everyday life. So beginning from where I know things, in many ways, the nation state is not far or never far from any discussion on data. We know that, of course, implicitly, and also in many ways explicitly when we talk about statistics. But in many ways, the foundational argument for the Indian nation could also be arguably called a statistical one, because if you look at Dadabhai Naoroji's work, Poverty and the Un-British Rule of India, was among the very early attempts to create data around India's wealth, so to speak, based on exchange and trade as well, in terms of holdings in India and in terms of what was being traded and occupied. And Heinemann and Dadabhai Naoroji collectively produced massive amounts of data on wealth in India to argue for a more reasonable rule. But it was also a very early attempt at quantifying a national economy, which in a more formal sense took root only in the 1930s. And it wasn't, so the first proper sort of national income accounting effort that started in Cambridge was only in the 1930s. So Simon Kuznets, among others, and also other people at Cambridge, B.K.R.V. Rao from India, of course, also was there. But to come back to what I started with, statistics is among the foundational arguments for an Indian nation and an Indian state. So how do we map the journey of numbers put out in the public domain, often to make social and political arguments, in its journey since, from the middle decades of the 20th century. And that's where Sandeep's essay, especially on Mahalanobis, is useful. To set that essay in context, one could look at actually a recent book by Arunabh Ghosh called Making It Count, and an essay that he wrote for the British Journal for History of Science, looking at Indian and exchanges between China and India in the field of statistics, where one of the most poignant arguments that he makes is for how data was conceptualized in China after in the 1940s, and how it was conceptualized in India at independence. And the major difference was that of census counting, or 100% counting, versus sampling. And Mahalanobis and his colleagues went for sampling as a preferred method for data collection, and which eventually led to the birth of the National Sample Survey, whereas the Chinese went for 100% accounting. Now, the implications of that are complicated and are very well worked out in Arunabh's book. The counter sort of case for India is still to be fully argued out, and I'm very, very, very happy that scholars are beginning to work on that. Of course, we have Sandeep's essay, but there's Nikhil Menon, who's sort of taken a bite at a part of it, and Nimmi Paidapati, whose work we eagerly await to see what she finds, because she's also, the National Sample Survey is also at the heart of her new work that she's currently engaged in. But I think that will be a very, very interesting story to map, and it'll be interesting because it also lies at the root of the continuum of the development of statistical techniques or processing techniques, which allow for sampling methods to appear for large data sets, which feed into what we do, or what we purport to do, or what we think we can do with big data today. And I think when we are able to map sort of the journey of the method, that probably is when we will have, and what I mean by that's probably when we will have a very, very good understanding of the political life of data. And what do I mean by that? I mean, of course, we have an understanding of political lives of data, in bits and spurts. But what sampling techniques in a way allow us to see is, what is it that we thought we were going to extract out of these extremely large data sets? How did we think we were going to construct those data sets, and how did we construct the categories around them? And I think it's a conglomeration. We of course currently have an understanding of the early stages of sample techniques in Alain Desrosier's work called The Politics of Large Numbers. But I think it's the later work, and which is what I'm most interested in, and I'm hopefully, before I die, write the book on the biography of D2 as a sampling technique, and its journey before, I mean sort of the before life and the afterlife of D2, which is fascinating because it helps us imagine what is big data created for, and what is it that we hope to extract from it. And when we run that through my favorite CCS machine, then the context and the chronology and the context and the specificities of each of those moments in the timeline of sampling techniques will allow us to tell a history at a distance from the debates on data, which today for me I float sort of very uneasily on, because of course it's political, of course it has an everyday life, but how does one get a hold into it, an intellectual hold into it, and that allows us to push the debate further, but also therefore allow us to have the tools to intellectually critique it further. Data, as I started out saying, and all of us believe, is never far from the government, but that's no longer the government is no longer the only producer of data, and the nation state no longer has monopoly over data. And so what implications does that have for statistics, which in effect was partly, or in many ways, the mechanization of government? And we have John Agar's fabulous book called The Government Machine, which discusses Britain. But what is the legitimacy of data, and what is the legitimacy of statistics, particularly in the context of ubiquity, or in the context where the state is no longer the only producer of data, and therefore, of course, you can no longer call everything statistics anymore, strictly speaking. And so questions of legitimacy arise, questions of, and what do these questions of legitimacy again mean, not only in the context of ubiquity, but which is also the fault line around ubiquity is that of two fault lines. One is the digital divide, as Sandeep himself reminded us. This is not, at the end of the day, sort of absolutely everywhere. So there are divisions, and there are places where this is not happening, or this cannot happen, but also in context of mixed bookkeeping practices, like in a government office, where decisions happen everywhere, and I'm in the middle of such things right now, which I wasn't 3 years ago, everywhere from WhatsApp to phone calls to emails. And when you have an audit, for example, which is what we're having right now, if all your correspondence is on email and WhatsApp, and only some final decisions are on paper, what does that mean? What counts, therefore, as information, and what counts as a decision? And what are the implications of all of this for the government machine? What are the implications of that also for the relationship of the state to various entities? I mean, again, we've had a sort of all-round discussion on the eroding authority of the state, or the sharing of authority of the state, the rise of large corporations, etc. But how does one? I think we need a relook at the government machine in terms of the information revolution, and especially in the Indian context, there are good scholarly works now available to look at these kinds of processes more critically for the United States, and only to some extent for Europe. An important point that Sandeep makes in his introduction is that data is not produced in silos, very rightly so. And this is something Arjun Appadurai established for us early on in the 1990s with his essay on the number in the colonial imagination. Data is relational. The question then, to my mind, is, does statistics, and what I mean by statistics here is a set of administrative routines needed to describe a state and its population, when that is not the only place that's producing data, are other data producing entities producing statistics, right? Like, are they producing what colloquially could be called stats as facts? How do we understand or dispute them? Which is, of course, at the end of the day, the critical question. These are disparate worlds coming together, right? Like, so if you look at what Desrosiers said, a few years ago, I'll just read a brief quote from him. What to statistics? A set of administrative routines needed to describe a state and its population. The calculus of probabilities, a subtle manner of guiding choices in case of uncertainty, conceived circa 1660 by Huygens and Pascal, and the estimates of physical and astronomical constants based on disparate empirical observations carried out around 1750, all have in common. And to this, one might today add computerization, or, and by computerization, I mean computation of data, and not merely the arrival of information technology. Only during the 19th century, and after a series of retranslations of the tools and questions involved, did these various traditions intersect and then combine through mutual exchanges between the techniques of administrative management, the human sciences, then called the moral sciences, and the natural sciences. We are back at a place where these intersections are, again, extremely important. And just to sort of look at how controversies at the intersection of these various traditions play out. And again, from de Rosière, and what he means by controversy, and what I understand also as a student of science and technology by these controversies, is what happens. I mean, what happens when you question data? What happens when you question statistics? Do you really believe what you're being told? As the joke went, never believe numbers that you haven't made up yourself. So what are the kinds of questions or controversies that arise around the presentation of state-produced or state-produced statistics or data? De Rosière would argue that these can be placed in two categories, depending on whether they concern only the measurement or the object itself. In the first case, the reality of the thing being measured is independent of the measuring process. It is not called into question. The discussion hinges on the way in which the measurement is made, so your techniques, the cleanliness of your data, the reliability of your enumerators, etc. The reliability of the statistical process itself, according to the models provided, be it by the state, the physical sciences, or industry. In the second case, however, the existence and definition of the object are seen as conventions subject to debate. And I think here is where the most fruitful production of debate lies. The tension between these 2 points of view, however, one viewing the objects to be described as real things and the other as a result of conventions in the actual work, has long been a feature in the history of human sciences, of the social uses they are put to, and the debates concerning them. This, it is, I think, one of the reasons why looking at these two kinds of controversies is extremely important, but also what they do is make an analytical intervention difficult, because it is difficult, as de Rosière says, to think simultaneously that the objects being measured really do exist and that this is only a convention. And it is in making this tension productive that I think future scholarship will benefit, and for which a very, very good beginning has been made in the book edited by Sandeep, and the work his colleagues have put into it. As I have said several times in the last few months, in the age of Cambridge Analytica and other comparable events and problems that we've had, it should no longer be possible to teach or study political science or other human sciences for that matter without a basic understanding of coding or algorithms. And I think it is that journey that begins with conventions of administration today to the conduct of politics and the very the legitimacy of the administrative processes that are brought into question by the ability of agencies other than the state to intervene and produce data that we need to find, a map, of course, we've begun to map, but also to understand and find our points of intervention to take this vibrant and emerging field further. Thank you again for asking me to join you all this evening. And congratulations, Sandeep, again, for having accomplished the task of what I call herding squirrels into producing an edited volume successfully. Thank you.
Thank you, Jahnavi, for this excellent map that you drew from the history of science. I mean, the various key questions here. One is the idea of the sample, and there will be very productive comparisons we can think of in the speculative way data is moving. Then this notion of ubiquity, which I want to tack on, and then this recasting of the government machine that you set up, and finally, the political status of this object of measurement, which is deeply conflicted, and it's true, and I suspect that problematic of the so-called government machine will continue for some time to come. So thank you again. I now want to ask Nimmi to take to speak on the book.
Sure. I think I've unmuted myself. No, you can hear me.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so first off, congratulations, Sandeep. I think this is a very important book, and I've read it from beginning to end. Of course, I always wanted to read it, but it became a goal in itself to read the book. I wanted to justify to myself why was I invited for this panel, which I'm very grateful for and I'm very happy to be part of. Then I realized that probably my morphing from a classical anthropologist to a technology researcher, also a technology researcher who focuses on human-computer interaction, probably that gives some justification for me to comment on your excellent book. I've made quite a bit of notes on your book, and my bit is going to take off from some of the sharp insights that I found in your book and kind of transforming them to a bunch of questions or queries or ideas that can be taken ahead, questions for the future and how to continue with what has been said in your lovely book. So there are some macro points, some micro points, and a lot of examples which I've drawn from your book and also from what I've seen around me. But being true to that classical anthropological training I have, I want to begin with pondering about the lives of data from a methodological, say, position, by methodological, of course, methodological is something that encompasses so many things. It's just not how you study, but also the status of the research you do because you've adopted certain methods to study, right? It's also a philosophical kind of an understanding, right? Data, as what Jahnavi said and what emerges from your book, the status of data is such a difficult, conflicted thing to establish, right? Not only in India, even this has been coming out in several studies from the center called Data and Society in New York. I'm sure Sandeep has been there and been a part of that. They periodically keep producing all these conflicted and contested ideas, concepts, studies about the status of data itself. And of course, it's a wide variety of subject matter that they produce, starting from labor to ethics to a deep dive into certain domains, a whole bunch of things. So there is an overlap between what's happening in the developed global north to what is happening in India. Probably the tensions and issues with the lives of data is everywhere, right? Everywhere, and there can be some commonalities. That would be interesting to see, how though you contextualize data in how it is generated, how it's studied, probably if we focus on India, there is also certain things that are linking these lives of data globally, and the problems we encounter are everywhere and probably similar also. That is something that struck me when I was reading the book. So coming back to methodology, the book throws out, data we know is interdisciplinary, it's socio-technical, it's constitutive, all those things, right? It's all those complex things all at the same time. Now, how do we, create tools to study lives of data, right? By tools, I don't mean the entire field techniques or several other, survey tools or psychological tools to understand certain things, but also evolving theoretical concepts, right? Because the actors involved here are, again, pretty varied. So at one level, you have the state, which is kind of prying on data. If you take the example of Aadhaar, which is looking at data to invade your privacy, to control everything from your body to your mind and what you do. And on the other end, you have corporates who, if you go to relationality, data hanging out with other kinds of data, if you look at corporates, you will see the data, let's say, coming from banking, right? is kind of matched and related to data coming from, say your Swiggy app. You know, what you spend on what you eat, right? Which is combined together to probably decide about your status of what kind of insurance you're eligible for. You know, this is the relationality of data is everywhere and can produce all kinds of statuses about you, right? So when you have a multiplicity of actors, you know, how do you deal methodologically with a problem like this? Now, again, it leads to the idea of data becoming powerful, oppressive, and as an exclusionary tool, right? So this directly kind of cuts into the idea of methodologically looking at data. So I am looking at this idea of production of fake news, for example, fake news, extreme or hate speech, right? This is one instance. News, right? This is again a huge amount of an amalgam of data coming together and into your feeds and all kinds of algorithmic, activities that are doing this, right, with big data and all that. Now, at one level, fake news is also produced organically, right? It also points. It could be something that is muddied by corporates or companies. And technologies themselves. At the other end, it's also what do you call an instance of expression, right? Everybody is a part of production of fake news. Everybody is a part of those WhatsApp forwards which generate these fake news, right? So it is also, there is this so-called notion of democratically looking at fake news, the production of fake news, right? It can be bottom up, it can be top down. It can be an invasion of free speech. It can also be generated by free speech. So these kinds of contradictory things that big data gives rise to, no? So this again is pushes you to a corner as to how are you going to deal with big data. In this case, say fake news or extreme speech or hate speech. If you take hate speech, for example, it could be Twitter that is amplifying hate speech and all those trolling and things like that. But who produces hate speech? Where is it coming from, right? It's so difficult to curtail it, from a certain point of view. Curtailing hate speech would mean curtailing so many other things, which hits at the heart of freedom of speech, right? So again, big data, the status of big data is again pushes us into this quandary of where do you situate it? Now, coming back to Aadhaar itself, right? There is one of your papers talks about the thinning of data because there are these certain formats that produces your personal data and your data as a person on Aadhaar, right? So it thins out so many other forms of ways of being. Okay, so that has been an ongoing critique from social science about Aadhaar data and what it misses out. But today, the Aadhaar contestation has gone on to several other things. It's about surveillance. It's about benefiting from Aadhaar and so on and so forth. The early critique was about the thinness of Aadhaar data itself. But this kind of made me think about when is that identity that Aadhaar creates not relevant, right? We at some point in time we seem to invest the identity which Aadhaar gives as probably the only identity we have. It somehow takes on that status because we want to build a seriousness about that, right? But when is so-called identities which technologies create for you not relevant, right? I'll give you an example. See, how is your Aadhaar identity important for social contracts that you enter into, like marriage or something like that, right? Is an Aadhaar identity important in your immediate environment where we reciprocate to social favors, right? So when are these so-called big data identities become irrelevant? So that is something which I was thinking about when I started getting worried about the identity which Aadhaar creates and this identity becoming overpowering and empowering so many other things, right? In fact, the whole incident or the instance of IIT Kanpur and the whole computerization pushed by IBM, at one level they used discarded computers, right, to push accessibility and push the whole culture of computing into India. So this kind of unethical practice by a corporate introduced computing cultures in one of our much loved and elitist educational institution in India, right? So how do we deal with such things? Now, again, I'm still with the idea of power and methodology and data. So if we look at, the notion of invoking life and data, the Jahangir Puri story, where the bias is at the source itself, right? You don't go to the source of data because you already carry notions of bias, right? So this is not only ethnographically proved, right, like in this instance, but also if you take census statistics, right? So apparently the so-called first census book exists in London, in the National Museum of London. I think it's during I think some king, some William, I forget the number that follows this this Prince William. This is supposedly 12th century UK. The conditions under which this census was created, right? And one interesting detail is the kind of data you give depending on who asks you. If imagine 12th century Britain and somebody with a sword riding on a horse asks you about what kind of land you have, how many goats or how many sheep you have, how many chickens you have, things like this, your answer is going to be very different from, say, somebody a little more, say, a friendly person coming and asking you about to enumerating you, right? So so if you look at the source of data and the kinds of biases that gets incorporated into data, it need not be only census. It can also be a part of an ethnographic field study, where this is a method we use to generate good data, right? So bias can come in various forms, and that also can corrupt the kind of methodology you are adopting, Now, I'm moving on to certain other notions of data that I drew from the book itself. One is, data as a semiotic entity, which comes up from the DLS in cricket chapter. Here, this was so fascinating because of the fascination we have for cricket itself and the kind of love we have for the game. And while reading, it drew attention to so many other things that draws us to cricket. One is about knowing something, the culture of knowing something through numbers, right? Which is entrenched in knowing the game of cricket and kind of immersing yourself in that game, right? And that has given rise to several models, right? It's not that the model is sacrosanct and it's the model that is producing all this fantastic knowledge, right, using data, but it's about what that model is built upon, right? It's built upon something else. It's built upon a cultural value, or it's built upon what the author calls as semiotic itself, because the value you give to numbers, the value you know about something, is what has given rise to this model, right? And it's kind of endorses all these models and the numbers game that we play while talking about cricket. You just have to turn on the TV to see the amount of statistics that's thrown at you, right? I mean, all kinds of permutation and combinations, all kinds of big data is used to crunch it, right? And give you all these details. And how many of them are kind of making sense, right? How many of this crunching of big data is making sense? So maybe it makes us think about not everything is relevant. Even the crunching itself becomes redundant after a point in time if you don't situate that data analysis in some framework, right? Otherwise, you can go on and on and on with all kinds of crunching and all kinds of processing of that data, right? Now, coming to text analysis, this is also something interesting, I thought, which is about understanding something through the methods you use. Okay, data has produced all these annotative capabilities to, say, understand the film, right? And at some point in time in the article, the author says that the way you gain knowledge or the way you understand an object of study depends on the methods you use to study that object. Now, okay, with that we all, is this question simply the lives of data question, or is this question, the relationship between the object, understanding the object and method, cuts across so many other disciplines, domains, and other kinds of knowing, right? So when we deal with lives of data, we can also kind of look out and probably leap, make that leap to tie it up with other disciplines of how we know something, right? So it's simply not the lives of data question here, isn't it? This whole relationship I'm talking about. So what does this insight give us? You know, how are we linking data studies itself to several other studies, right? So maybe we can kind of look at certain questions we are asking as tying up with other broader questions beyond this domain itself. Now coming to actual, say, the technical aspects of methodology. You know, when we talk about open data and machine readability formats, and also summarization tools, the PDF, so on and so forth. These are all technical aspects of how do we study data, right? So there were a couple of interesting ideas that I kind of thought about. One is, when we talk about reducing, this again links to the thinness of data when we collect because of certain formats that we employ. Here it could be the machine readability from formats or the summarizing tools, which in your Excel sheet, which was there was a reference made to pivot tables. You know, how the PDF was not friendly to the pivot table, and how Excel sheets were more friendly, and then data has to be in certain forms, right? So if this is a problem. So when you make data, data open, you know, when you talk about open data and making data open, how much of these problems follow? You know, even when you make data open, what are the risks of making data open? That is one way of looking at it. And the other aspect of open data, which Lily Irani talks in Hackathon, is more political, right? She brings in the notion of politics, intervention, and ethics to acting on data itself. And this question, interestingly, is also something which anthropology asked in its early days, when action anthropology was becoming very popular, you know, but where you intervene, you do ethnographic and immersive studies so that you're able to act upon it, right? So this whole idea of politics and open data and data in action is also a question that scholarship has been grappling with for a long time, right? So the questions we are asking in lives of data are also kind of intertwining with the questions that have always remained in scholarship and research, which I think is very interesting. Now, again, come to there's another interesting notion of power in the PDF, you know, which was really kind of also funny, that how certain people preferred the PDF because it had this authorial. PDF was authorially kind of fixed. You know, there was an authorial intention in PDF which was not there in other kinds of formats, and that became very important. You know, some people preferring certain formats which came with all these kinds of inscription and power and so on and so forth. And also tied up with this is how this was also in one of the papers, how certain, I don't know which one, I forget that, how certain upgradation that did not take place in management of data made it kind of inaccessible. And if you look at, if you come to this from a power play point of view, you'll see that maybe people don't want to upgrade, especially in the government and in the context of state, because they don't want it to be transparent, right? So technology itself, I mean, keeping away from technology itself becomes a tool of not making yourself transparent. So you hide your data through technological means, right? Probably that could be one reason why certain departments are not upgrading technology. So last 2 points. This is something I think about all the time because I'm this HCI anthropologist turned HCI researcher, you know. This is the layer we add to big data, which is data visualization, you know. In my opinion, I don't think any kind of big data can be consumed or understood with another layer of on top of it, which is the visualization layer, you know. Even in the book itself, there are many chapters that throw all kinds of graphs, right? There are graphs, pie charts, there are graphs that show movement, you know, growth and things like that, you know. And if you look at the data visualization, this is a layer which can mislead, you know, if there is some kind of an original, you know, idea or intention about producing a data set. That itself is in quotes. If there was or is an intention to producing a data set, the data visualization adds another layer which could mislead you. In fact, there are several studies in HCI that have pointed to how visualization techniques has played with how you perceive data, right? There are so many ways, clever ways of visualizing data, which leads on, which produces a certain version of how you consume that data, which is used by several governments. You know, how do you look at, say, what different countries spend on, say, war, for example, or on weapons, for example. The way you visualize the data can put across a certain perception. So this is something that we'll have to deal with somehow. Though it is an HCI problem, I think any kind of big data that is crunched and that is ready for you to consume has an added layer of the formats in which it is ready or made ready for consumption, you know. So that, I think, is something that we have to think about, which I understand why visualization is not a part, does not enter into this bunch of probably this bunch of articles, and why I thought of it. Probably it's also the kind of training one has or whatever it is, you know. So this is one angle I thought I could raise in my discussion. Then finally, again, I'm still sticking with the methodology theme. You know, I'm giving all kinds of angles to the meta theme of methodology and the tools and how we study big data. This point is about materiality and data, and I'm particularly looking at the Hisab article. When you look at materiality, you know, when Rupur is talking about Hisab, how certain actors in dealing with big data are also kind of putting across their own crunching, right? They also crunching with data, and it's also in a different form. The materiality form, you know, the form of data itself is different. Now, this made me think about how this second order processing of data, which is material, it need not be material also, it could be something else. In this case, it is material. Who are eligible even to do this kind of processing, right? as a political act. If who are these drivers in this case who keep an account, right? These people have to be some kind of literacies have to be there. You know, I did a study of Uber drivers in some cities in India, and many of them did not go to school. In some strange way, this gig work in India has brought in many more organizational aspects that was unavailable in the informal sector in India. You know, so there are plenty of people belonging to scheduled tribes, scheduled castes. You will find a lot of people from these groups, you know, coming on to becoming Uber drivers and jumping onto this kind of gig economy, you know. So it opened up a certain space. So these people never kept accounts because they didn't know how to keep accounts, right? So it also kind of calls out to this idea of who are the people who can do such information acts, right? This again goes on to the question as who can become a data scientist in India, right? Which in itself is an interesting question, because these are the people, data scientists are the people who are delivering big data to you. They are these guys who are building programs and applications and algorithms and with all kinds of cutting edge technologies and bringing it to you. But you see, the person who does this is also a certain kind of person who can become one, becomes a contested thing. Not everybody can be a data scientist. Even at the level of who can keep even a notebook and keep some accounts of some information, do some information processing itself is limited to certain kinds of people, right? So there is that exclusion at that level itself. Okay, so I think I'm done with, maybe I've missed out certain points, but I think I've overshot my time. So, so these are some of the ideas I had when I read the book, and I thought I would kind of call them as a methodological rumination. So some may kind of tag on to that, and some may have not fitted into that meta idea, but this is what I have for Sandeep and his authors. Thank you so much for being so patient with me.
Thank you, Nimmi, and I thank you for focusing on the methodological issues. I now invite Stefania to make her intervention.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the lovely invitation, but also thank you to all the speakers that came before me, because I don't know whether you saw that, but I've been furiously taking notes. I think this is a great occasion of learning besides the book and around the book, right? Which is actually ultimately what a book project is always supposed to be about, but we know very often that's not the case. So I'm very excited to join Ravi, Nimmi, and all the others in celebrating this awesome accomplishment. So my warmest congratulations indeed to Sandeep. I'm impressed you did it by yourself, by the way. Typically in this type of herding squirrels, as we have heard earlier, it's always nice to be in good company, not only of your authors, but also of someone, you know, keeping the process tight. So I'm even more impressed to know that, you know, you manage all of this as one person, although I'm sure, you know, that all the people around the room today and, you know, participated in the workshops, contributed, not only in writing the book. So I've known Sarai from probably the early 2000s. It was actually 2005 when I first collaborated as a young student with Geert Loving, coming to Amsterdam from London when I was living back then, and leaving with an awesome book, which I have to say, because I've been, you know, traveling, migrating mostly, you know, as I'm one of these academic migrants following the job market. The book ended up actually, I have the certainty now in my parents' place back in Italy, but for a long time it was not only a good company, but also a good, you know, example of how to do research and how to do a research that matters. So ever since I've been following, the work of Sarai from the distance, and it is, a great pleasure, great honor to be with you today. But no matter how honored, in fact, I feel a bit like an imposter today, in the sense that I've had a long interest for India, and even more so, all this computational culture and amazing experiences from the grassroots app. But it's only recently that I started really engaging explicitly with India as a field work or site of field work. Starting recently a project on political micro-targeting, in fact, with a colleague who knows much more than I do about the country. So again, this is a great occasion for learning. So, I mean, we've heard already a rich discussion, so I just try to keep it brief, also because here in Europe it's lunchtime, I'm kind of starting to starve. But also because I would like to focus briefly on some more kind of cross-cutting issues, which are very important in this book project. So the book is open access. And it's not banal. It's not banal because all of us have been part and are regularly invited to be part of projects which are actually not accessible to the broader audience. But what also interests me here is that I see this book as a crucial stepping stone, a little break in a grand project, a grand program that needs really the help of everyone and the contribution of everyone, which is what, from the perspective of me and my colleagues, and here I cited Emiliano Treré and Silvia Masdiero, respectively from Cardiff University and the University of Oslo, have called big data from the South. So in an attempt to change the terms of the debate, change our ways of approaching and understanding, change, if you want, the theoretical and conceptual tenets that we use when we approach anything computational or data related, in the assumption that we cannot, we don't want to run into the problem, into the risk of universalizing what we know and all the basic tenets of our work. So, what we try to do from the data, from the perspective of data for the South, is to make space to challenge really, what are mainstream notions when we look at computational cultures, for example, that emerge of data cultures, data practices that emerge simply in different contexts, trying not to minimize the importance of the context. We have heard already quite a lot on context today and the importance of situating the experience and the writing in it, but also I would like to add that we are all very situated in our writing and in our approach to this type of exercise. So I think this book is really of paramount importance as we try to make room and make space for other epistemologies and other worldviews. And it's also particularly important because as I said, I see it as a starting, as a sort of stepping stone, as a starting block for something else. I'm sure Sandeep is a bit worried about this in the sense that probably thought, okay, I've done the book, I'm done, right? Well, actually, what I think is so powerful in a book of this kind that has the possibility of circulating wide and far, precisely because it is open access, that this is just the start of a conversation, of a series of multiple conversations, which incidentally here they happen in English, and English being our lingua franca, but that might even be done occasionally in different idioms, as a lot of us are, by the way, not native speakers in English, but that are a great occasion for mutual learning and in the attempt to, if you want to use a popular notion, decolonize the way we understand computational cultures and data cultures. I can already tell you that for one, so I'm currently teaching, co-teaching with two awesome colleagues of mine, a master elective course as part of our media studies master, or master actually in new media and digital cultures here in Amsterdam, on digital activism. And we've been over the last few years doing a consistent effort in trying to decolonize and diversify the writings that we expose our students to. This year, my own personal geographical focus is actually Latin America. I was already starting to work before I saw this book on moving on to Asia for next edition of the course, and this book is going to definitely be part of that. So thank you very much for that. I also do believe it's particularly important as we try to make sense of the first pandemic of the data-fied society, as myself and other colleagues have called it. So a pandemic, I mean, a global health crisis, which of course has been very well, becomes a crisis in many, many, many other sectors of human life and human existence. But that is special in that this dimension of the lives of data, of the data infrastructure that they've heard so much about, and of the cultures and practices that go along with that, and the grassroots responses, and the attempt of subverting and surviving in the cracks, even though we are trapped into this biometric data sets and you name it. It becomes very, very important. So it's a sort of reflection on the go, which then makes also this book more crucial, more difficult to take home, and more important as we think through all of this. So yeah, what I want to say essentially is that the point from which we see things and we observe certain phenomena and we observe it, certain set of phenomena, in fact, because we're talking about very plural processes and dynamics here, matters very much. And this book shows it in a really brilliant manner. And then the second cross-country point that I would like to highlight here is on the importance of involving practitioners. So as someone who comes to this with an activist background, but has been playing the academic game for a while already and lives into the academic environment, well, of course, on the one hand, I realized that all of our colleagues, academics really are desperate to be relevant. We all want to be more than a book in the library. We all want to do research that matters, but in fact, few are able to do so. And few have the courage to make space for a dialogue that involves also people that are doing things, are making decisions, are engaging in practices and crucial practices as society as a whole makes sense of all the challenges of the computational and data-fied aspects of society. But in fact, the process of actually doing it is not super easy or super smooth. So what this book, I think, does in an excellent manner is to make space for the voice of practitioners in the editorial projects. In that, I also want to, spend a word of praise for the publisher of the book itself, the Amsterdam Institute of Nectar Cultures. We already heard, the thanks at the beginning of the session, but I do believe also that not many publishers will allow us to do so, right? We all know when putting together a book proposal that one of, the lenses through which publishers look at it is like, is this a viable commercial product? And of course, with in academia, what we're very fond of are these big names, and if you want famous colleagues that have a power of attraction that, of course, else accomplishes what the publisher wants. So I also think it's important to remember that. All in all, I would like simply again praise Sandeep and all of the authors for this amazing accomplishment that is gonna, I do believe, be a very important stepping stone in this effort to create a learning space where we can decolonize, deconstruct, and learn together what the computational culture today means in practice in our daily life. And I encourage all of you to really take time, spend time also possibly with the printed version of the book, which is particularly beautiful. I'm still waiting for mine. I'm a bit jealous that Sandeep already has one. But of course, as the editor, you should. But it's a beautiful artifact, and it's something that will feature nicely in everyone's bookshelf, but especially in everyone's again daily practice and daily thinking and engagement with all these challenges we are going through. Because all the chapters, and I'm not going to mention any in the sense that it will be a bit like it's so rich that I would probably simply end up underscoring the work of someone by highlighting the work of others. So I'd rather not do that, but I really encourage you to spend time with this amazing piece of work, and especially make sure it doesn't remain just a building block in the sense like of a fixed building block that we put there somewhere, but that we actually build together on top of it. So I do believe this is the beginning of a much needed conversation, or if you want, series of conversation. So thank you very much again. Congratulations. And thank you also for this awesome panel where I've learned so much already.
Thank you, Stefania. And what I'd like to do now is maybe I want to ask Akash, who's one of the authors, to join the discussion. And one of the interesting things to throw up for questions, you can send your questions to chat. And Akash is here with us. Is in your chapter, Akash, you focused specifically on the status of the office, the governmental office, while it is dealing with these different regimes of which is the management information system on the one hand, which is coming as the impulse of the pressures of the new design of the office and the way people practice in the office. I wonder if you'd like to open up by talking a bit about this is the operative tension between the larger question of data, which is highly rhetorically affirmed, and how actual offices are trying to play up with it. I wonder if you can come in and open up some of the questions before we wait for the chat questions to come in.
Sorry. That's a question that stayed with me, that continues to stay with me, Ravi, in terms of the tension of putting the digital infrastructure, whether it is done on premise or is it comes in terms of various subscriptions to what is known as platform as a service, etc., and to sort of fit it into office spaces which are often continue to be cubicle based, or at times open up for limited reconfiguration of the physicality of it. So one of the things that I've been trying to look at in an ongoing project is a office building where half of the building setup has been redone in terms of what is now being popularized as more open plan workspace vis-a-vis or in comparison to the rest of the building continuing to be sort of very cubicle based, right? So in terms of what the conference-y-like or always on conference-y-like open plan glass based offices do to sort of work practices, I think it's sort of remains an open sort of question and open inquiry.
Thanks. I want to start off with a number of questions for everyone, starting with Sandeep. Sandeep is the author of, the editor, and he deserves to be celebrated. But there's a number of questions, and this ties up with what Jahnavi raised. One is the speculative nature of contemporary data as compared to the earlier statistical, the history of statistics. Which is, so what you have now is a kind of non-rational governance. And I don't mean non-rational as pejorative, something that does not emerge out of human design. So this is the Catherine Hale, the larger question. What happens when the thing we call consciousness, as the designated authority of knowledge about science, about everything, to this repository, once you open it up, so one is the emergence of speculative, and the notion of contingency is built in the whole design. And when you opened up, and that's why we have all these constant panics, misinformation wars, mass anxieties linked to data, like the nature of the landscape changes. So the non-rational as a form of knowledge production opens up all kinds of bizarre questions. And in the Indian context, I can think the last year has actually made certain things visible. I should say tangible. So I would like you to talk a bit more about this. And then I want to go back to, Jahnavi, something that you really, opened up. And one is, I think, if you go back to the history of statistics, and you talked about, you know, particularly the 19th century, and then the coming of the national movement. What do you think, as a historian of science, looking back at the 20s, 30s, etc., what is your, you know, you're working in Bangalore, you're the director of the science gallery, you are encountering a different world, and I definitely don't want to put you on the spot and cut your funding. What's your sense of the comparison of these different knowledge practices, if you like? Because one of the key points you made is the shift from this government machine, where statistical knowledge is being produced via the state, which is a kind of rational knowledge, to this proliferation of new knowledge practices, where it has gone outside the state. And then I have a question for Nimmi. And Nimmi, you know, you talked about particularly Uber drivers, and I think it's a larger question than the social origin of a person who deals with income, because number counting. Various anthropologists have talked about number counting. People who may not know how to read and write definitely have practices of using fingers to count, and different accounting practices. And I think the challenge, I think, for us is to understand these accounting practices when people encounter interfaces, because the key here is the interface, computational interfaces, that various sets, delivery boys, Uber drivers, large sections of working people are encountering in this world. So I think it's maybe a question of different forms of discretion. One is computational discretion, and this so-called accounting world. Are they actually two separate worlds? How do we build a kind of methodological tool where they overlap with each other? And secondly, and finally, for Stefania, this notion of the South. Could you talk a bit about it? Because the South is also an abstraction, like the North. What does it mean in computational terms? Because the largest computational populations are in the so-called South. We've seen the last 2 decades. So how do we fix these terms? So that's a very big question for us in this context of global inequality in and through platforms. So I want to start with Sandeep, if you can come in.
Okay. Thank you, Ravi. Thank you, Jahnavi, Nimmi, and Stefania, for your generous comments and questions. I'll respond to Jahnavi's question filtered through Ravi's reframing of it, that what happens to government, and John Egar's wonderful book, Government Machine, tells us that unlike the notion that bureaucracies are inefficient, they don't they don't really adopt to these technologies, many of these technologies were designed for them using their practices. There's a brilliant anthropologist, Manuel Castell, who has written about the intextualization practices of bureaucracy. It's open access again in Computational Cultures, the journal. One of the challenges of doing this kind of work in India is that we don't get, it is hard to get critical distance from the state. Unlike the US, where you can write books and books about unpacking the military-industrial complex as if it's a God-given gift, that ARPANET just happened and then everything was built by brilliant innovators after that. Here, the state is right here. Like, I don't mean civil lines per se, but conceptually, in terms of abstraction, in terms of everyday presence of the state in these practices, whether it is a private platform like Twitter, management of speech, politics that we know are painfully too aware of in these days, or it is the rational work of producing knowledge about citizens, making populations governable, making them visible. Where does that shift really happen? And this is one of the challenges, that we map the shift from late colonial to early post-colonial period, but from that time when ISI is first set up to now, where ISI also partners, or ISI-like agencies, government departments, ministries also partner with tech startups to do surveys for them, create dashboards for them. And you go and ask them, why exactly is that? Because there is a certain value now associated with those dashboards, as several chapters in the book. And that value is not about knowledge production. I mean, for all you care, they know the knowledge being produced is not really useful. And what advertisers also know, that the kind of knowledge big data produces about your travel habits or your consumption habits is not really knowledge driven. It is inherently speculative, but that speculative nature does something. Even if it is non-rational, even if it is bizarre at times. I, in New York, get all kinds of ads about beef burgers. Everyone knows that I'm a vegetarian, but I still get them. And I enjoy looking at them. It's like, okay, the machine is still not getting it. But that, as opposed to how Mahalanobis wrote at length about the errors that were going on in the survey process. And here is another challenge about history of statistics in different parts of the world. Mahalanobis is largely the only voice in the archive, or at least the archive that I have looked at. It's very difficult to find other voices. Bhavani Raman, in one of our earlier workshops, asked me this question, that what is the caste of these human computers? And I tried to look it up, and there is no mention of it. Who are these people? Mahalanobis hires them from season to season to do the counting start. The first employee of ISI is a human computer. But except for his expert-driven voice of what this system is, how it will contribute to nation building, there is no other perspective. Unlike now, where it is harder to find the authorial voice, that who is the author of these systems? Who made Arogya Setu? Many of us are looking for that answer, right? So there's a displacement of the engineer, of the designer, of the expert, and the knowledge they can possibly produce, and the knowledge that is desired out of their expertise. That is a key shift that has happened here. And state is being a very important actor in India, because it is the state that signals through Aadhaar that, look, we are ready for these wider transformations. We'll create the APIs, application programming interfaces, for you to make apps on government-related data. What comes out of those apps, probably 10 years down the line, we'll know better. But this space is critically organized by the state and its technological infrastructure.
Thank you. So Jahnavi, you want to come in?
The standard line of 2020, unmute yourself. So I'll pick up on what Sandeep was explicating actually quite well. The other voices in the archive of history of statistics when compared to now, it's an interesting question you raise, but this, in a way, it's not different to the question that other historians have raised about no matter what kind of history writing you want to engage in, right? Like the voice of the subaltern, so to speak, is almost always either hidden or erased or, whatnot. But there are some other important voices. So the voice of Haldane, for example, in the ISI archive, or C.R. Rao, who is still around. And if you get the chance, I think you should try to meet him in the US and talk to him. And it would be a service to the community if you're able to. I tried. I got some traction, but not a lot. So maybe you can. So, but coming to Ravi's question, which will again link back to what you said, I think the major sort of the major difference between the government machine and the proliferation of data producers today is one of purpose, right? Like the purpose, as again, you outline in the book, but also just mentioned is legibility, right? Legibility for governance and enhancement of governing practices. And there was a desire to produce what scholars might call knowledge, right? Because if you look at early volumes of statistical information and data, and they were commentaries, right? Like they were commentaries, and they were not always numbers. Sometimes, I mean, in fact, when they started out with political arithmetic and statistic, or statistic, they were descriptive data. They were not necessarily numbers alone, and they were commentaries. And I think that is something that's very, very different to now, where the purpose is diffused, and therefore the author is also diffused, as you rightly said, Sandeep. the purposes, I mean, there are many. So, legibility of the consumer is linked to some of the biggest data producers, which are large corporations. Legibility of the which is often couched also, but also packaged as legibility of the self. So, production of data of the self, which ranges from various devices, but also self-narration in a sense that is made possible and prioritized by social media, for example. So, in a manner in which even a few years ago was not possible. I mean, my phone wants to tell me how many steps I took today, and quite frankly, I don't want it telling me any of that, because it's, yeah. So the ability to govern versus the ability to sell, the ability to convince, the ability to create the grounds and foundations for a buy-in into various processes. So there's a diffusion of purposes, but there are some very large ones because there are some very large data producers, right? And it's now the feedback of these mechanisms and these practices into state practices, which serves the purpose of surveillance for both, right? So the practices of surveillance is served for both agencies. And I think what would be interesting for us is, and that's why, coming back to my earlier question, I mean, I think it speaks to, I might be accused of a bias, and it speaks probably to my training in civics and politics before I moved into history of science, that the state is still very, very important to me. Also because my generation was brought up on the Foucauldian need to behead the king, and I kept feeling sorry for the head of the king. And I was like, no, this is an important aspect. We need to understand the state rather well. And I still continue to want to understand the state well, because what do these moving practices now from large bodies, which often have capacities greater than that of the state to produce data, what do these practices mean for governance? What do these practices mean for the government machine, so to speak, right? Like, it's not just merely the material capacity of computation, but it's actually the practices themselves. So how does, and again, in terms of surveillance, we've had work. So this is what I mean, right? Like, as a historian of science trying to trace this journey, I often feel like I'm drowning and in this sort of sea of incredibly important moments that are studied, which need to be brought together. So I think that larger piece of work tracking this transition needs to be done, where what's happening in this sharing of practices. The stress on knowledge, again, as Sandeep pointed, now is less important. It's information, irrespective of whether it's actually useful or not. It's the thirst or the hunger or the greed or the avarice for more and more information. Everyone wants your phone number. Everyone wants, as in your mobile phone number, and everyone wants to send you, track where you're going, etc. It's not really coming together, right? Like, it's not really coming together. It's not without reason. I would still like to argue, and maybe I'll be proved wrong. I don't know. Again, I mean, Sandeep's generation should tell us more. Myron Weiner saying that India was a functioning anarchy, and I don't see that that's still changed much, right? Like, if you look at the essays in the book, when practices break down on the ground, I mean, forget even the digital divide and the fault lines of multiple practices, etc. So I mean, that of course is normatively speaking a place of hope, but analytically speaking, what has actually happened to governance needs to be examined, because our expectations of the state are shaped in turn by what we are told, the speculation part of it, right? The speculative, I mean, gosh, I'm very, very weary of social sciences having moved to history, but like, has speculation and what kind of speculative practices now inform governance, and therefore how does that affect the decline of the welfare state, is also a transition that I think needs to be articulated in the Indian context more with more depth, I think. Does that answer your question, Ravi, or have I kind of rambled on?
Yeah, why don't you wait for the round? So I think somewhat, Jahnavi, but Deepu is going to come back on your point, because it's a key question between the history of science and contemporary computation, because they're seen as a kind of caesura. contemporary computation with new models seems, there's no sense of a larger history. And I think one of the things that the book is trying to do is break these two, the walls between these two. I think open it up, and that's the reason you're the panel. So Nimmi, you want to come in? Please unmute yourself.
Yes, I've unmuted. Yeah. So with regard to the materiality argument, and Ravi very interestingly pointed out to all the new actors who have joined the long tail of, all these, the big data production system and the business, along with the business models, the courier person, the delivery boy and things like that. No, the first thing is the stubbornness in the material existence of data. That is not going to go away, right? Just like this accounting book, lots of data are going to have a material life. They are not going to have a digital life, and they cannot be captured through a machine. Now, what do we do with this, right? How do we even begin to understand the other half of data that don't have a digital life? That is one way of looking at materiality, the notion of materiality, starting from the Hisab book to the various kinds of material gifts that people exchange, right? So, in fact, there is a very lovely story about how in Chinese tradition, you have to gift fresh, crisp notes, if you're giving cash, right? And how do you capture those kinds of traditions that are obstinately non-digital? That is one way of coming to materiality. But the other way is what I was alluding to is going away from the material question and talking about who constitute this huge data machine themselves, So who is even capable of dealing with such information processing? And it is that which is also not captured. If somebody cannot keep Hisab, if somebody cannot become this data scientist who can become a part of that big data machine and be a part of that entire information processing world, So what are we leaving out? What are we leaving out when we don't understand those entities that cannot be part of this world? That is the second idea I was trying to refer to when I was talking about who are the people who are part of this machine world, So these two things. And the third thing, taking on Ravi's response, is how do we capture these various kinds of numeracies, if I may use that word, these various capabilities to data process, right? How are we going to even methodologically integrate that as life of data, right? If the delivery boy or the Swiggy delivery person has a certain kind of capacity to read big data or to be part of the big data, how are we going to capture that? Because clearly that is a different kind of life of data or the existence of data, how do they become data points? So these, I think, are the three angles I would like to kind of call out when we talk about materiality and data.
Thank you, Nimmi. Stefania, you want to come in?
Yeah, thank you so much for this stimulating conversation. I was asked to comment on the notion of the South. And yeah, good question. The South isn't abstraction, as a geographical market, and it's probably simply misused and misplaced most of the time. So I'm not sure I actually know exactly how to fix this term. This is, again, a question that needs a lot of work and a lot of collective work. What I can tell you is that the way myself and my colleagues use it, it's actually the South as a metaphor and as a proxy. And in fact, we already substituted it with something else. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. So the South is, for us, not a geographical marker, or let's say it's much more than that. So we're not just using South as in global South, but we're using South to indicate all the occasions and situations of inequality, disempowerment, injustice, but also creativity, subversion, appropriation, and resistance that we encounter actually pretty much all over the world, as I said, not just in the global South. Now, this is a bit of a sensitive operation, and one that, of course, might run into the risk of obscuring even further the so-called global South. But we started using it starting in 2017, because we were in the moment in what was called the South. We were in Colombia and Latin America, and we were actually asked to organize an event, and we decided to call it that way, as a sort of as a reminder of the fact that the South actually is much more. And when we talk about, for example, datafied policies, or datafied inequalities, of invisibilities, this has to do with much more than our classical understanding of where poverty and inequality might be, or we might find it. I mean, gig workers who have been evoked here in several occasions are a perfect example. We might be, for example, in Amsterdam, which is where I speak to you today, but I can tell you that gig workers here are suffering in a very specific manner, probably very different from gig workers in India, but there are also some commonalities. So, and this is how we talk about the South. And in fact, we talk about the South as a plural notion, not as one South, right? Which is also something very problematic with the notion of the global South in itself. I have to say that because we have been frequently misunderstood, we're trying to do this operation, we decided to we change it. So we're now talking about data at the margins. And the margins is, again, something that can be understood as a geographically determined terminology, in the sense that the margins, in the same way in which we might criticize the notion of alternatives, simply presupposes the existence, in the case of alternatives, the existence of a mainstream, which is unfortunately in common sense superior to the alternative, right? So this is also a dynamic that we like to break. But and if we talk about the margins, we might again presuppose the existence of a center, which again is associated with more positive aspects than the margins might be. But we are trying to actively deconstruct that by giving voice to the margins, and by situating bringing the margins to the center, if you want, or centering the margins. So this is what we are trying to do. What does it mean in computational terms? That's a very interesting question. I made note of that, and that might be the object of further conversation also in the space of, for example, big data from the South, big data sort of coming from the margins, which are the experiences that I co-coordinate, co-launched, and that I speak to you from that privileged observation point. If you want. So I'm not sure exactly that I know how to fix the term. I know for sure that we need to problematize pretty much anything further, both the geographical notion, but also what we associated with all the terms that we have put on the table today. So again, I don't have an answer, but
thank you.
We have made space to try to reflect on that collectively.
Thank you. Some of my colleagues have questions here, and then Sandeep will come back. I want to start with Avadita Sharan.
So this is just to keep with the Jahnavi's thing on generations. So my sense is, about 20 years back, you said you were studying the government. You would have been somewhere lower down the pecking order of political science department, studying something called public administration. So it's an interesting transformation how with media studies, lives of data, subjects of that kind, the government comes back in a different way and is studied very differently. So I think that itself is worth thinking about, how traditional political science studies government and how, say, media studies government. I think in terms of the specific question that I had was just on the chronology part of it. My sense is that for all that we have said about the many producers of data, the chronology goes back to the state. So it's only the practices of the state that find space in the chronology, possibly because that's the one that's available in the archive most easily. So what other chronologies do we go back to? I mean, two we could definitely think of pretty straight up. Say data gathering done by manufacturing companies on resources or things like that, or data gathered by advertising companies in the 1950s, the heydays of the advertising companies. So there are other data practices that it seems to me somehow get lost because we keep returning to the state as if that's the only history that we have. And there's nothing wrong in doing all the things that we do about how to understand the state and the government. But I think there are other chronologies that are well worth pursuing.
Thank you. Thank you. Pratima Banerjee.
Hi, it's a really enjoyable panel and a really enjoyable book, no doubt. Actually, I was going to ask something similar to what just Deepu stopped at. Just to kind of add on to that question, I'm thinking of earlier scholarship on capitalism, right? And there is this constant tension between imagining something systemic called capitalism, which is driven by some autotelic processes, accumulation, value addition, circulation, which in some senses do not rest on subjects or agents, right? Mm. And then there is the other part of the scholarship, which insists that we need to study the actors and not a kind of systemic abstraction called capitalism. You must study the state, you must study corporations, you must study the working class and so on, right? So I'm trying to understand in terms of our conceptual apparatus, what has changed when we study something called, I mean, we call it both things, data capitalism as well as data governance, right? And it somehow seems to echo that earlier story of either going the autotelic way or going the actor way. And in between the triangulation of the people, stroke worker, stroke user, and state and corporation. I just want to feel where there might have been a move in the last, let us say, 20 years of the changed world that we're living in. So that was one thought. Of course, I mean, there's no answer to it. I know that. I mean, I just want to think with you on that. And the other thing is, of course, incited by the invocation of the global South and decolonization, etc., which find its home in places that I'm more familiar with, such as political philosophy or cultural studies or such like. I just want to understand what those terms, I mean, Ravi already asked this, what those terms mean in the context of data studies, or does it mean anything at all? Or to put the question differently, are we talking of diversity of contexts when we talk of global South? Or are we actually, or is techno-diversity imaginable in the first place? So I just want to think with you on that as well.
My other colleague, Ravikant.
Thinking of chronologies and parallel, data gathering practices, especially those that deal with affective, situations and people, or affective economies at least. Of course, there are, for example, in the 30s onwards, right? We have data, once again, being gathered by radio of licensed people who held licenses. That was the only way in which you could understand how many people are listening, because there's a question of piracy as well. But that's still state, right, by and large. Box office is another huge data. Without that, you could not really, understand cinema. The work that Ravi does on advertising and consumerism, etc., there are all kinds of data practices there. And so, and then if you think of something like Binaka Geetmala, which goes on week after week after week after week, there were data gathering practices all set up in small towns all over, India, maybe South Asia also. So how does that, immediately, obviously we don't account for all that. History is yet to be written, I think. Even traditional data gathering practices by non-state people and institutions are not written as yet. So the difficult question, Sandeep, and it's a difficult question for all of us, is also how then the transformations that happen, for example, let's take the example of something like an emoji, okay? Okay, there are faces that we face and try to read those faces. We don't know, we struggle. And then we write novels to describe those emotions. And we use a whole thesaurus, right? But with emojis, right? And behind emojis, we also hide, right? We are back to some of those faces which we go on diversifying, right? Giving it different colors, different, emoticons, etc., context, etc. So it's a very interesting interaction, as it were, happening between abstractions as well as representations, as well as human beings who are involved, of course, in cohort with machines and against machines as well. So, I mean, there are challenges all around, very interesting area that you are opening up. Thanks.
So we've almost crossed 2 hours. So I think, Sandeep, I'll let you have the... So, there's one question is on why is it called the lives of data? Then there is one question on is anyone who's assembled a bibliography of key literature on digital media and technology and focuses on India. And her Alet's research focuses on South Africa. And she says she's found Indian literature most relevant. And Sandeep, you can get back on that. Then Rashmi is asking if we discuss data and governance as if the state has a well-planned scheme into moving into a datafied society. Absolutely. Working for a government department and dealing directly with e-governance portals and platforms, what I see is a chaotic, truncated, fashionable adoption of technology, because data is what everyone is doing. What happens when an entrenched, inflexible bureaucratic practice and people situated the lower rungs of bureaucracy encounter manipulable data, which requires a different framework of thinking and doing. In fact, Akash's chapter struggles with this. And Maya Ganesh said, she has a long set of questions. She is interested in the space between data as infrastructural, historical, material, situated but not necessarily as data as personal, till perhaps Aadhaar. I'm comparing the West and North here, where it is almost impossible to talk about data without centering a personal privacy vis-a-vis the human. I think, Maya, you've got something there. I'm not sure if this is just about Indians, in quotes, who have a different notion of privacy. Is there something else from the history and evolution of data practices and data semiotics in India that tell us about the genealogies of the human? There is a lot about persons in this book, but I'm interested in your thoughts about the shaping of the human through data. And all kinds of anthropomorphic questions and the so-called correlationist questions that we can open up here, when we have these two things, human and data. Social media, of course, makes us have digital identities, and feminists in particular have written quite a bit about this. I think a lot of these questions, actually, Sandeep, you have to deal with it. Yes. I'm not so sure you can address all of them, but I think you can definitely respond to it. Yes. Thanks. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much for all the brilliant questions. I have two confusions to share with you that will perhaps enfold some of those questions that you've raised. One, there is a great amount of dissonance in terms of how certain traditions of social sciences, humanities approach the question of South, the developing world, the post-colonial world, and so on. And this, pardon the use of the word, this sort of new world where people are like, we have arrived. What are you talking about? We are a digital superpower. We are the third biggest startup ecosystem in the world. We have more than 500 million mobile subscribers, billions of devices, large companies, this and so on, right? So part of these tensions play across registers. In Jahnavi's case, between statistics and the contemporary computational system, what happens to the state, because the state was the reason there are to collect this data in the beginning, if you look at the statistical genealogies of it. And here again is a sort of struggle with this, because this is first of its kind of attempt of sorts, that you need to first target the biggest elephant in the room, right? But there are other elephants, there are other rooms, definitely. And a related confusion that has happened is that with a lot of this hype cycles and so on, we are supposedly living in the fourth industrial revolution. One may ask, where is the second and the third one in India? First, I would say probably yes. So that creates these new possibilities which do not fit into some of our older categories. I'm not confident enough to throw older categories apart. There's a tension that we need to think through of how those older categories approach the state. I mean, what is the state where NSA Snowden happens, when Panama happens, or when Aadhaar is projected as a state entity, but all the actors who are deeply invested in monetizing it, creating infrastructures on top of it, have no association with the state. They come from all over the place and their credentials are also not known, right? So the porousness between what the state and non-state is not the same as what used to be in public administration and so on and so forth, right? So my dissertation project, if I make a short pitch for it, focuses on computational cultures at the intersections of the state and technology startups in India. It's very difficult to recognize who is the venture capitalist in this domain, right? Who is cultivating aspiration and who is speculating on the aspiration. The boundaries are shifting than what they used to be. State capital relations go as back as the history of social sciences, right? Another key question about the affective dimensions of it, radio, cinema, and so on, and their media studies really has a lot more to say than history of statistics. So these two traditions are the most important ones if we have to look at history of data, and their work of Professor Lisa Gittelman on how paper in different contexts has animated much of our ideas about what knowledge and data production means. You mentioned emojis. One of my colleagues from NYU, senior colleague, Luke Stark, who graduated from a department, has worked a lot on what these emojis means and how they circulate on these social media platforms, right? So again, something that at one end is absolutely rational, coming from sciences, statistics, mathematics, algebra, and on the other hand is also coming from the deep end of humanities, interpretation, inscription, affect, and so on. So there's a lot of confusion in between. What I probably couldn't address was Maya's question of genealogies of the human. I wish I knew the answer to that, because the material that we have collected so far and we have seen so far is that who is really interested in the human here? Because the human itself is a grand abstraction who is already sold out to the idea of a certain kind of development, of a certain kind of interface, of a certain kind of consumption pattern. A human who may have never had an email account is now 12 hours a day on WhatsApp. It's a very difficult genealogy to create. And I welcome any other suggestions on how to go about doing it. Of course, there are archives of how it is imagined. It's not that there aren't, but there's a very particular powerful flux through which it's happening in this quote unquote datafication mode, where it's difficult to keep track of the human. There are collectives, collectives, clusters, not publics, as Ravi has often said, is a post-publics. Right? Yeah.
Could I just add a little bit to it? Ravi, do I have a
yes,
moment?
go ahead.
I think to address, so I'm actually, Deepa, I have no idea how, if I may, how you knew that I stopped studying civics and politics exactly 20 years ago. But I think you have a very good point there. There are other chronologies. I was thinking like a historian, so I was answering more to the 19th century and prior to the 19th century. So the chronology running from there. So, looking at it in terms of extremely broad waves, where data collection moves from a statist agenda to, the East India Company implements some of that statist agenda collecting in India, right? So you already have something of that mix right there, but it's a statist agenda informing the East India Company's collection of data. Whereas today, and then of course, the transitions of that at independence and after with Mahalanobis, but also many others. And then now we have sort of slowly moved, if we think in historical long durées, right? Like, and this is also not that long durée, but still, if we, from the social sciences perspective, sort of fairly long time periods. From there to now, where it's, for lack of a better word, a corporatist agenda or agendas informed by large, capable corporations that are invested in collecting data. And when that begins to, those practices and that data begins to inform governance, what happens then, right? So I think it's that transformation and transition that, to me, conceptually, as Prathama very rightly pointed out, what does that do to a conceptual apparatus? And who are we studying then to make legible that conceptual apparatus? How do we explain things with it? And to what purpose, right? And I think you already pointed out some fabulous, archival sources for that, right? Manufacturers, advertisers, producers of this, manufacturers and producers, but also consumers, right? Like consumer data was collected by consumer societies, associations, etc., and those various points. But that larger history, as Sandeep says, there's so much to be done, but this is such a fabulous start to it, right? Like, to break, this volume breaks ground in that sense, bringing the historical and the social sciences agenda, in a sense, on this, on a continuum, and to see how we might, through this transformation, explain some of the changes that are happening on the ground.
Thank you, Jahnavi. I want to thank all the panelists, all the people who ask questions, all the people who ask questions. But before we go, a small announcement, and this is important for your benefit. Next week, please come back. Professor Francesca Orsini delivers the B.N. Ganguly Memorial Lecture on the 24th, and the title is Hindi Internationalism, Literature in the Cold War. So please come back. So thanks all, and have a good evening. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.